So, Christopher, I'll start with you. I think you first read the book at Oxford. You adapted it 84, 85. Yes. So just briefly tell me, what was it about the material that appealed to you first as a student and then as a kind of playwright?
Well, I read it first when I was about 19, and it was a revelation to me. I mean, I knew nothing about the ins and outs of human depravity as represented in the novel, and I sort of thought it was at that age it impressed me as the best novel I'd ever read. And so, several years later, when the National Theatre moved to the South Bank in 1976, they had 3 theatres suddenly rather than 1, so they were looking for writers to do things, and they asked me if there was something I'd like to do, and it suddenly came into my head that Les Liaisons Dangereuses might work as a play. So I put it to the literary department, run by a man called John Russell Brown, and none of them had read it, so they all went off and read it. And then they said, well, we don't really understand how this is going to work, because the 2 main characters never meet, which is the case in the book, which is an epistolary novel. They write to each other. So I said, well, I had it in mind to make them meet. Anyway, they turned it down, and it was about 8 years before I wrote the play and got the Royal Shakespeare Company to do it first. So that's where it was first done, and then it was some time before we got to the stage of making a film of it.
So you played the West End, I think, for 5 years, went to Broadway, won a load of Tonys. When did you first see it? Did you see it here? Did you see it in New York, or did you not see it at all?
I saw it later, but I hadn't seen it when I got the script. I read a film script.
Oh, okay. So let's just talk about the film script, because when you adapted the play into the script, you actually went back to the book. Is that correct?
Yes,
I'd
actually done a number of adapted a number of my plays for the screen, and they'd never seemed to work properly, and I couldn't. It took me a long time to figure out how different the cinema is from the theatre, and by the time in the mid-80s that this happened, I'd done a year's work with Fred Zinnemann, and I'd done a year's work with David Lean, and I sort of was beginning to grasp that the cinema called on made different demands. And so, but in fact, I wrote this screenplay in rather at high speed and in rather a panic, because over our shoulder was the looming figure of Milos Forman, who suddenly announced in the middle of it all that he was going to make a film based on Les Liaisons Dangereuses as well.
So we'll come back to that in a second. So you read the script.
Yeah.
What was it about the script that appealed? Because obviously you'd made Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, Prick Up Your Ears,
All
Might Be Full
perfect preparation.
Yeah. So was it the period? What was it that appealed to you?
Did you enjoy it? Yes. That's what I did. I was no different from them. I read the story and thought, this is great.
Fair enough.
What else are you supposed to think? Oh, how interesting. How sensitive.
So what does it say about love then?
Well, it's both good and bad, isn't it?
Well, what it says about love, I suppose, is that love isn't necessarily the same thing as sex. And
shocking.
And I guess what else it says is that what's interesting about the book, one of the most interesting things about the book is that it's only when the hero has a kind of a decent impulse, i.e. he falls in love with this girl, that everything collapses. So that he is part of a perfect system. They both are part of a perfect system, which relies on people not being in love with one another, and that system is part of a society which also relies on people not being in love with one another.
So Stephen, you said you read it on in January, and the film came out in...
Well, you said you put it through the door on...
I did. I put it through his letterbox on January the 1st, and we were shooting on May the 30th, I think. And it was in the cinemas in November.
No, Christmas. Christmas
Was
Day.
it? Christmas. Just before Christmas, that's right. 21st of December, that's right. You're
So
right.
why did you put it through Letterboxd? Why Stephen? What was it?
Well, I'd worked with him before, and I knew he was very good.
You did a pretty good job, let's be honest. So let's
I
talk
was
about...
so out of my depth. It was such a huge leap. The budget was suddenly astronomical.
Actually, people did say to me, who were sceptical, said, we don't see any evidence that Stephen Frears is the man to make a period picture. And I said, well, honestly, trust me, what you need for this particular subject is somebody who's not interested in making a period picture, who is interested in making this subject, and not all the frou-frou and all the stuff.
You mentioned letters. I think in your screenwriting lecture you did at BAFTA, there's 20 letters that move the plot forward.
Yes.
Did people want that in the film? It's an unusual kind of mechanism for cinema, isn't it?
Well, I think we talked about this when I started, which was that of course the book is constructed of letters, and I had completely eliminated that from the play. And indeed, if you see the play, you'll find out that Madame de Merteuil escapes at the end because somewhere in the script she says, "I never write letters." But when we came back to this version, it seemed that, like a novel, you could use the letters to move the plot along in a rather efficient way, which isn't available to you in the theatre. So then we started to have fun with it, really.
Normally when you adapt a theatrical production, people tell you to sort of open it out, but you didn't. It's very kind of interior. It's people talking in rooms, and you see the outside edges of kind of France and Paris. Can you talk about that decision?
Well, that's how it was written, so it never arose as a possibility.
I feel it was sort of opened out, particularly in the first third. I think you do get about a bit, and then it sort of closes down on you, and the lid comes on. And these people drive ever more speedily towards their doom. But to start with, yeah, it is. But it never dwells on the scenery or the settings or whatever. There's a great scene right near the beginning where there's an enormously elaborate coach, and you shot it with just the front edge of the coach coming up outside the door of the convent. And I remember people saying, "Isn't he going to show the rest of the coach?" and no, because that's what that was the way to do it.
Let's talk about the casting, because I think you said you only wanted actors who had appeared on the stage, and
Well, I
apart
got
from
it
Michelle.
wrong, didn't I? Well, it's a proper text, and it was a play, or had been a play, and it needed actors who could handle text, I guess. And there's quite a large area of the American cinema. Well, first of all, it had been a play at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and this whole enterprise was so financially monumental to me and so risky that I somehow didn't want it to be part of the British theatre. I didn't want a sort of genteel play out of the English theatre, a sort of adaptation of Oscar Wilde or what. I don't mean to be rude to anybody, but you know what I mean. I didn't want one of those films. And the company who were making it said, look, actually, we would rather you didn't cast poor Alan Rickman and Paul Lindsay Duncan, who had created these parts. Anyway, for some reason, the idea of working with these American actors who were just intoxicating emerged. And that seemed so exciting. So I went down that road.
Can we talk about...
But, now I
Okay.
remember what I was going to say. But it's really all to do with John Malkovich, isn't it? I used to say to John, can't you do it faster? He said, well, I don't know where to breathe. I said, well, didn't they teach you that in drama school? He said, I've never had a day's lesson in my life. So actually, I'd got it completely wrong. This man who came out of the theatre, out of this theatre called Steppenwolf in Chicago, he simply wasn't a sort of trained actor. You know, I was used to English actors, you know, acting properly. And Glenn could do all that. But John had no idea about it. So he literally didn't know how to breathe.
I got so exasperated when he said in a scene, I'd fall to my knees. I remember going to speak to him and saying, whose else knees are you going to fall to? For God's sake, try to get the emphasis in the right place. But, you know, he has an extraordinary quality
And what he was doing was fantastic.
Was marvellous, yes.
So, you know,
there was an etiquette advisor, wasn't there? A French guy. He quit on us because the idea of teaching John Malkovich how to bow and so on just defeated him.
And when you read the reviews at the time, he was quite a controversial choice. People were complaining he wasn't handsome enough.
Yeah, but he's very sexy, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. And
What? What did you say? Magnetic.
Magnetic, yes.
Oh, you mean we cast the wrong person? I mean, I couldn't think of anybody better. And he was doing that play, wasn't he?
Burn This.
He was doing this play called Burn This, in which he was, like here, so electrifying.
I waited for him outside the stage door on Broadway with the script in my hand, and as he came out, I said, you don't know me, but would you like to read the script?
And he did. And Glenn, was that... Had Fatal Attraction come out at that
No.
point? It hadn't.
Had it? No.
There is a story.
Okay.
Glenn was going to take over in the play. They took the play to Broadway with Lindsay and Alan Rickman, and it played and jolly good. And then they were going to replace the cast.
We had a replacement cast, and the replacement cast was Glenn Close and then unknown actor called Kevin Spacey.
And they said, the management said, Glenn Close isn't famous enough. So they cancelled the whole thing. 6 weeks later, Fatal Attraction.
Yes.
So-
Hindsight's a beautiful thing.
Yes. No, it was what I learnt in the first week. You know, I mean, I'm embarrassed about my ignorance. I wanted to make it, you know, like a sort of piece of offals or something. I wanted these very, very elaborate movements. And because I'd spent my life looking at the English theatre, it seemed to be quite unremarkable. But of course, the American actors couldn't do this. They simply couldn't make the scenes come to life in that very English theatrical way. So I was just being a fool. And gradually, at the same time that I was facing defeat on this front, I started to realize, but the bits that are good are where they put the camera on the face. And in the end, I realized, oh, I see, this is what they're good at. This is what they're not so good at. Why don't I make a film of the good bits? I mean, it is that simple. Sam Mendes the other day it is to do with adaptability. And once, someone like Michelle, her face was so dazzling, so you stopped worrying about all the other bits of her because her face was so electrifying, and the same with John, and eventually the same with Glenn. So I changed my whole approach in the course of that week. Thank God.
Well, here's how the book ends. The book ends, I think, in a way that the author felt obliged to end it. In other words, not only is Myrthe revealed as who she is and booed at the opera, she then gets smallpox and becomes disfigured. And she then loses, there's been a trial going on all the way through in the background, as happens in French literature, and she loses all her money and runs away to, I don't know, Amsterdam or somewhere. And then at the very bottom of the last page, the author has a footnote, and he said, as a matter of fact, even worse things happened to her, which I can't tell you about. And that's like a kind of a wink from the author, saying, you know, I have to do this, I have to have a moral ending. And when I read the play, I thought, well, I don't have to have a moral ending. I'll do what I like, and what I liked was to somehow leave her with sort of ashes in her mouth. Really, she's won the victory, but it's cost her tremendous amount of pain and suffering for the rest of her life. And somehow, the film seemed it seemed more. It seemed better to go a bit back towards what the novel had done. Indeed, we did all kinds of alternative endings. We shot her being guillotined, if you can believe such a thing.
But I read somewhere that you watched the rushes and you burst out.
We did. We roared with laughter.
Clearly nothing has changed.
So that wasn't going to work. So the very, very end was fluid up to the last minute, wasn't it? And it was actually Glenn who said, because one of my ideas was to have a great line from the book just on the screen at the end, which the line in the book is, "From then on, her soul was written on her face." So we were going to have that at the end, and Glenn said, "I can act it." And we did that in one take in the corner of the studio. She did that, taking off the makeup.
Fantastic.
It's full of peculiarities. Why does Michelle Pfeiffer die? What does she die of?
She dies of a broken heart.
Of love.
She dies of a broken heart. They don't do it anymore. But
good job, there wasn't a...
in the 18th century...
If you imagine the script meeting about that, she dies of what?
Did they want a happier ending? This is the film studio?
Listen, luckily, they had, the point was that it was a Lorimar film, right? And Lorimar went bust during the first week of shooting. So there was a slight moment of panic 2 or 3 days in. And then Warner Brothers, for reasons best known to themselves, God bless them, bought the whole thing lock, stock and barrel for the small amount of the budget. And then they never, one lady from Warner's came one day, but we never had any trouble at all.
Well, it was about men in frocks, so they didn't want anything to do with it.
There was a wonderful screening for Warner's where one of the guys said, "I didn't know it was going to be without music."
No, that was much later.
Before the music came on, and he said, "Well, it was like being in the theatre."
And I suppose it helped that you had this other movie happening
breathing
at the same
down
time.
our neck, yes.
So it was, as long as you were first, it was okay.
Well, it was certainly very. There was an immense amount of pressure, and in fact, this film should never, by all logical reasons, this film should never, ever, ever have been made. It was only because there was this maverick company, Lorimar, who were not frightened off by the spectacle of the man who had won the last 2 Best Picture Oscars, and decided to go forward. And indeed, it was a wonderful man called Bernie Brillstein who masterminded the whole thing, and who really didn't mind about. He didn't care about. In fact, there was a famous stockholders meeting in Lorimar when Lorimar was sort of going downhill, and apparently the chairman said to Bernie Brillstein, the company is in terrible trouble, and you've spent money to buy the rights to this thing that is out of copyright, which Milos Forman is going to make a film of. What is going on here? And Bernie said, "Well, if we're going bankrupt, what difference does it make?" I think she was in love with him. But in fact, I don't know that Leclos would agree with me, because because he described her in a letter as a being incapable of love.
But he's dead by then, isn't he? He's just died.
He's died, and I think that's what breaks her up.
Women all over the world will do that when John Malkovich dies. There'll be a large breaking of mirrors.
It's not in the script. I think it was improvised.
I'm not sure you can improvise a hiss, but it came from John.
It came from John.
Neither Christopher nor Leclos.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I had an email from John today sending you all his best because he knew this was happening.
The bit right at the end when Glenn is booed in the theatre and then she comes out and she stumbles, was that a scripted moment? Was that your...
No, that was not a scripted moment.
Glenn.
So again, that was the actors. We were very, very lucky with the actors.
And also, what you're really talking about is serendipity. You know, when it all works, all these things happen, and you think, oh, well, that's jolly good. I can't take credit for them, or I can only tell you, well, this is what happened on the day. But when a film works, there is a great deal of serendipity involved.
There's a scene in it where Michelle comes upon him with the courtesan, and she gets very upset. And this was a scene of some discussion because we were, it was a long dialogue scene, and I think Stephen quite wanted to cut the scene. And John said, no, I think I can do something. And so he invented this thing where he's telling this lie, and he's so amused by the lie that he's telling that he can hardly stop laughing. And it's so powerful that the scene, which, was a sort of legitimate candidate for, the chop, in the way that happens with scripts, was transformed into a scene, that is extremely memorable.
I think it's one of very many memorable scenes in a fantastic movie. So please put your hands together for Christopher Hampton and Stephen Frears.